And I love that this is 13 episodes into season 1. We've had all of this character building up until this point, and that this is the mid-season finale. Like, this is the kicker. This is setting the trajectory for the rest of the season of season 1. Bloom discovering and finding out who she actually is. Hey there, welcome to the Winx Forever podcast. I'm Lola, creator, host, and lifelong Winx fan. I'm taking a deep dive into the very cool universe of Winx Club. So join me each week as we rewatch and discuss each episode starting with season 1 of the original series. So whether you've been a Winx fan since 2004 like myself, or you vaguely remember the show from your childhood, or maybe if you're even being introduced to it for the first time, I want to say welcome. This is the Winx Forever podcast. Hello, fellow Winxers. Welcome back to the Winx Forever podcast. As always, I am your fairy-loving host, Lola Valentine. This week on the podcast, we are continuing our season 1 rewatch with the mid-season finale, episode 13. And also, funny enough, this is going to be the mid-season finale of the season of the Winx Forever podcast. So after this week, I'm going to be taking a little mid-season break from uploading, but don't worry, I've got a bunch of fun things planned for everyone who follows along on the Winx Forever podcast Instagram and other social medias. So be sure that you are following on there because you won't want to miss any of it. But for now, let's dive into season 1, episode 13 of the original Winx Club series. The episode title for the Cinelume dub of season 1, episode 13 is called A Great Secret Revealed. And the 4Kids version of it is titled Meant to Be, which the 4Kids dub title plays off of a song lyric in a song that's featured in this episode that really means a lot to me because it is very nostalgic, and growing up with the 4Kids dub, this was a very powerful episode for sure. So let's dive into the synopsis, which reads, Bloom returns to Gardenia to visit her parents, showing off her newly acquired powers. She discovers that she is actually adopted and that her adoptive father, Mike, actually found her in a fire during one of his firefighting missions. Yeah, that kind of lays it out with the major plot points that happen in this episode. And so let's just get into it scene by scene, breaking down the episode, the Cinelume / Write English dub compared to the original American dub, the 4Kids dub that I grew up with. So as we mentioned last episode, episode 12 ended with the girls being excited for their upcoming vacation break. So they are about to go on holiday and have a break from studying and go back to their home realms. For Bloom, this means going back to Gardenia on Earth. So we still don't know where Bloom is actually from. We still think that, she is solely from Earth, but kind of have gotten a glimpse here and there leading up to this episode that maybe she, isn't just an ordinary Earth girl. Clearly, she has these magnificent powers and she wants to learn more about them. So it's time for vacation and Bloom decides to go back to Gardenia. She spends her time helping her mother in the kitchen, sloppily cutting some carrots, and seeing this Vanessa kind of takes over the task that she assigned her to cut carrots. And then she comments on how much Bloom has grown. And them being distracted with their conversation, they didn't realize that the oven had started releasing black smoke and they were burning whatever they were cooking in the oven. Bloom smells it and alerts her mother, and Vanessa panics and grabs a nearby cloth and tries to, fan out the fire with the hand towel, I guess. And Bloom urges her to let her take care of it. And using her powers, Bloom successfully absorbs the fire. And Vanessa jokes that while she may not be great at cooking, her powers are certainly beautiful, which is a nice sentiment, I guess. Thanks, Vanessa. But in the 4Kids dub, this whole episode was presented in a very different way. Instead of this episode beginning right with Bloom and Gardenia with her mom, it actually starts with Bloom in her dorm with the Winx, and she begins to tell them what happened to her and Gardenia over the break and why she was kind of like sad and mopey. It then transitions to Bloom narrating her time over the break, starting with when Vanessa asks her to help in the kitchen, which Bloom says, which was strange because she never does that. And Vanessa seemed like she really wanted to tell something important to Bloom. And Vanessa starts to talk about when she and Mike adopted Bloom. So in the 4Kids dub, Bloom already knew that she was adopted, which is something that I really liked about the 4Kids dub take on this. But the following sequence, when Bloom noticed that the roast was burning in the oven, Bloom actually says a verbal spell to control and put out the smoke. Whereas in the Cinnaloom Rye English dub, she just uses her powers without saying any verbal spells. And that happens a lot between the differences of the two dubs. Is the 4Kids version really gives a good like oral representation of spells and magic, whereas in the Rye English Cinnaloom dub, it is more of a showing instead of telling. But you know, neither are bad. I think that they both bring, you know, a unique perspective to the magic approach of telling the story. But definitely loved that in the 4Kids dub, the spell that she does use was the same spell that Griselda used in episode 5 earlier in the season when the Winx were in the kitchen at Althea and they burned something in the kitchen, and Griselda used the spell Aerolux, which helped clear out the smoke in the kitchen and made it spotless. And that was the spell that Bloom used to dissipate the smoke in her mother's kitchen. You are listening to the Winx Forever podcast. So Bloom continues to share with the Winx that things still felt kind of off during her stay in Gardenia over the break. The next day, Bloom takes her bike, which we of course saw in the first episode, which is kind of funny to think about. Like, Bloom, like, this bike is still brand new, has only been used a couple of times. Like, the fact that she still has this brand new bike. Of course, she doesn't really need it at Althea, so it's just, you know, hanging out in Gardenia, collecting dust until she comes back home to use it to ride across Gardenia. But she sees her father and his coworker and says hi. I thought that was really cute, you know, like, it's very wholesome seeing kind of like this small town version of Bloom. You know, her dad's, you know, a firefighter, most likely a fire chief. Yeah, it's just really cool to see. But Bloom actually arrives in Mitzi's neighborhood, and she's walking her bike only to be greeted by none other than Mitzi herself. And Bloom explains to her that she's on break from school and here to visit. And of course, that makes Mitzi curious onto where she's been and proceeds to try to get information out of Bloom, but obviously to no avail. And Bloom continues on her way after speaking with Mitzi, and she notices that Mitzi hadn't changed a lot, you know, like she's still the same Mitzi, annoying as ever in Gardenia. But she also realizes that Bloom, you know, herself feels different, and that attending Althea has changed her a lot, and probably for the better. But then as she continues on her way down the street on her bike, Bloom suddenly sees this sort of dark blue, misty apparition coming from a man walking across the street. It is then that she discovers that she has developed this new power where she can see people's auras, like the true nature of the person. And she sees it again with a woman walking across the street who snaps at Bloom for staring at her aura, like being like impolite, which is really interesting. But I did love the narration that Bloom gives in this part of the episode in the 4Kids dub, especially the narration of her figuring out her new powers to read people's auras. Like, other than Bloom's narration in the 4Kids dub of this episode, the dialogue between the 4Kids and the Cinelume dub pretty much, for the most part stays the same with slight variances here and there, but like it's nothing too major that, alters really anything other than the way that Bloom is recounting the events of her break in Gardenia. So Bloom finally reaches her destination, which is her mother's flower shop, because Vanessa is a florist, and I love that. I love that Vanessa is a florist and Bloom's roommate obviously is Flora, the fairy of nature, and it's such a good combo, and I love that kind of foresight, I guess, the writers had of making Flora Bloom's roommate, and Bloom having at least some appreciation and knowledge for flowers and plants, because obviously her mother is a florist. I think that's so sweet. But Bloom parks her bike out front before entering, and she notices a man in a limousine. And this is a little bit of a foreshadow because this man will come to play later in the episode. But Bloom kind of seems, a little suspicious of this, but kind of brushes it off and enters the shop. So inside, she sees her mother with two strange men, Mr. Brown and Mr. Bonner. Bloom, using her newly found powers, can see the auras of, and she sees that these men are not looking to be business partners with Vanessa, but they are actually plotting to take over her mother's shop and turn it into a large chain of supermarkets. After they leave, Bloom explains to her mother about the real plans and how she knows it, using her new powers that she's discovered literally just today. It's very funny to see how Bloom can recognize, a new ability she has as an ability and not see it as something wrong with her. And I feel like that's due to a lot of her training that she's received at Althea. So Vanessa obviously is trusting in her daughter's abilities to see people's true inner selves with their auras. And so she calls the men back after they leave the store and decides that she's, changed her mind about the business agreement that she was originally going to sign with them. Of course, Mr. Brown tries to convince Vanessa to rethink her decision, but Vanessa doesn't budge, and irritated, obviously, Mr. Bonner issues her sort of a first warning and accidentally, quote unquote, knocks over Vanessa's plant that was on her counter. The two of the men angrily leave the shop and decide, in order to get Vanessa to hand over her business to them, that they actually need to start vandalizing the shop, because that's logical. And Bloom, obviously, she uses her powers to be able to put the flower pot back together. And it was very sweet. It was a very cute moment, because in the 4Kids dub, Bloom actually says to her mother after, the pot was broken, "Check out the spell that my friend Flora taught me. She hates to see a plant with a broken home." And I absolutely love that detail. Like I said, the foresight that the writers had to pair Flora with Bloom as a roommate, and it's so cute, and I love it. So the small detail that the 4Kids dub had in adding that dialogue of check out the spell that my friend Flora taught me, like, it's just so sweet. Also in the 4Kids dub, Mr. Brown of this businessman duo was also named Mr. Bonner. So their company name, I guess, was Mr. Bonner and Mr. Bonner, which I assume was like in America, there are many like lawyer firms and such that are owned by families. And so, the lawyers would have the same last name. So, so Mr. Bonner and Mr. Bonner could be a play off of that very Americanized, like, trend, I guess, for attorneys and lawyers, which is very funny. But over the course of the next few days, Bloom enjoys time with her family. However, throughout those few days, Mr. Brown and Mr. Bonner's threats become more and more apparent. The first of which was Mr. Bonner knocking off the plant, quote unquote, accidentally at Vanessa's shop. The second threat was a brick that was thrown through the flower shop's glass door window. The third threat was, it looked like them on a motorcycle with a bat and came and hit a flower vase that Bloom was putting outside for pickup for a customer. And Bloom does her little, magic trick that that Flora taught her to repair the vase and the flower's broken home. But the fourth threat was Bloom and Vanessa were coming back from lunch, presumably, and Vanessa notices that the doors to her shop were forced open and broken into, and the whole shop was completely destroyed. Everything in it was damaged, and it was just, it was really sad. So back at home after dinner, they were relating, all of these instances to Bloom's dad, Mike, and he, he's so upset about it, and says that he won't allow this to go any further. And so Mike says that in the morning they will hook up a new alarm system in the shop, which surprises me they haven't had before now, but whatever. I guess Gardenia doesn't see that much crime. I don't know. But they all turn in for the night, and Bloom relates to the audience, I guess, that she has a strange feeling. And then while she is sleeping, she literally has a dream, or I guess rather intuition, that her mother's shop is on fire. And so she wakes up and screams, and that alerts her parents to come see about her and asks what's wrong. And she tells them that there's an emergency and that they need to go to the shop immediately. And so that's exactly what they do. They, jump into the car, which I thought was very funny because there's this little, it's not very long, but there's this little sequence of them in the car heading to the shop. And that sequence was kind of cut out of the 4Kids dub, but I thought that was funny in the original that they showed them actually on the way to the shop. Like I said, in the Cinelume dub, there's a lot of showing, not telling. And then in the 4Kids dub, there's a lot of telling and, not that they don't show it, but there's a lot of filling in that, is done by the viewer because we are being told, obviously that happened, so we don't have to show it to you. So yeah, it's that being, halfway through season 1 and having compared, 13 episodes now, between the first American dub of the 4Kids dub and the original English dub of the Cinelume dub. It's just, that's the best way that I can describe it, is the Cinelume dub does a great job of showing, and the 4Kids dub does a great job of telling. So they make it to the shop and see that the flower shop is completely on fire. And Mike calls his team of firefighters and turns to comfort Vanessa, who obviously is completely distressed. So Bloom sees that if, they don't act quickly, that the whole shop and city block with it could easily be destroyed. So Bloom bravely heads inside the shop to try to stop the fire, like she did obviously with the fire in the kitchen, but this is obviously a much larger scale. But out of concern, Mike insists that he goes with her. So while they're inside the burning building, Bloom has a protective fire shield around them, and it's protecting them through the fire. But as they walk further into the center of the building, Bloom starts to see another vision, which is funny how, first of all, Bloom finds herself in way too many burning room situations. Like, we had it in episode 6. We had, the fire incident in the kitchen at Althea, the fire incident in the kitchen at her mom's house. So it's like, girl, you tend to be surrounded by fire a lot. Like, is that foreshadowing? Probably, but here we see that Bloom is having another vision, but this time it is not of Daphne. It is of her father, Mike, who is rescuing a newborn child from a burning building. And that's when she hears someone call out for help and realizes that she kind of comes to out of that vision, and she realizes that the driver that she saw parked outside of her mother's shop, who was actually Mr. Brown and Mr. Bonner's driver, is trapped in this burning building. So Mike helps him out, and Bloom, using her improved powers, now extinguishes part of the fire just when the firefighters, arrive to help. In the 4Kids dub, when Bloom is having the memory of Mike finding her in the fire, a voice, mysteriously is telling Mike to, quote unquote, save me, take care of me, which it sounds very similar, obviously, to Daphne's voice that we also have heard earlier in the season. Also, the specific flashback scene of Mike finding this baby in the fire is featured in the Season 1 Game Boy Advance game that I've mentioned several times on my Instagram. And it's very nostalgic for me to watch that specific scene because I remember playing through that game so much and watching it over and over. It's just very, very sweet. You are listening to the Winx Forever Podcast. So once they make it safely outside, the driver tells Bloom and her parents everything. That Mr. Bonner and Mr. Brown were extremely upset that Vanessa had broken off their deal, that they had sent out threats in order to teach her a lesson, and then their final act was setting the shop on fire, which was done by the driver himself. However, he got trapped inside of the flames. Obviously, the driver completely regretted his actions and sincerely apologizes for it. And this is where Bloom's new aura reading powers kicks in again, because she can see his aura and tell that he was really truthfully sorry and that he was telling the truth. So the driver is taken into custody by the police, but before doing so, the driver tells Mike that he will completely come clean about everything about Mr. Brown and Mr. Bonner. And funny enough, in the 4Kids version, it's not the driver who started the fire. It was actually the Bonners who started the fire, and the driver actually went into the building to stop them when he realized what they were doing. And so I like that version of it because it gives the driver more redeemable qualities and not that he was just a puppet in the Bonners' schemes. So I really liked that take on it from the 4Kids version. Regardless, it's pretty much the same story. But the next day, it shows us Mitzi irate in her bedroom because she has the TV on and she's so mad because Bloom is deemed this hero, and she's throwing this pillow everywhere, and it's really funny. In the 4Kids dub, she mentions that the next day there was a whole ceremony for taking down Mr. Bonner and Mr. Bonner, a hero ceremony or whatever, for her parents and her and the driver. They even got to help clear the driver's name of, any wrongdoings because Bloom vouched for him, which is pretty nice, nice little touch. But back at home, Vanessa tells her family that the money from the insurance that she got for her shop, that she'll be able to build an even bigger shop. And that's, exciting. And Mike adds that they will get the quote unquote best alarm system that money can buy. But Mike notices that Bloom is not eating. Clearly distracted, Bloom, is still kind of tilted about the vision that she had of her dad saving a baby from a burning building. And Vanessa then asks, Bloom, what's wrong? So Bloom tells her parents about the vision that she had while they were in the burning shop. And her father reveals that the baby was her and that she was adopted by them. And obviously this rocks Bloom's world. She's devastated and she is crying and asks, why hadn't they told her earlier, and Mike obviously gives the poor excuse, in my opinion, of explaining that they wanted to tell her when she was old enough to understand, but couldn't do so. And then this discovery of magic and fairies and ogres and magic realms had blocked that opportunity, which both Mike and Vanessa reassure her that they had always loved her and will never stop loving her, and Bloom embraces them and tells them that she loves them just as much. And then we get this really nice sequence of Bloom thinking back to her growing up. And it's really reflective of her kind of reminiscing of her childhood with this new information that she's not even blood related to her parents, and even though they do love each other very much because these are the people that raised her, she is probably wrestling with all of these questions now, who is she? Where does she come from? This totally makes sense of why she has these magic powers. It's a very powerful moment in the series, and I'm getting goosebumps thinking about it because the way both dubs of this scene had me absolutely bawling. I cried. It was such a huge deal, obviously, in the 4Kids dub to find out that Bloom isn't actually from Earth. But I mean, in the original, when she didn't even know she was adopted, come on, that is next level. I cried so much rewatching this. The dialogue, the 4Kids background music. I mean, all of it was so great. And rewatching it, I even loved, how it truly felt like it was well represented even in the live action adaptation of the Netflix series Fate the Winx Saga. That was something that I really, really do think that Fate got right in their adaptation of the series. And man, it makes me excited, for season 2 of Fate. But at the same time, it just reminds you that Winx Club was such a different level of kids, entertainment. It dealt with real heavy things. And this scene is just proof that the original series didn't dumb anything down for its younger audience. This was rated TV youth, 7, I think, 7 and plus. So, and I was, 9 when this show aired. So the fact that they went there, they are wrestling with Bloom discovering that she is adopted, doesn't even know who her real parents are. This is heavy. This is really cool. And I love it. So the break comes to an end and everyone returns to Althea. Bloom is seen lying on her bed and she's, remembering her past with her adopted family. And Flora is comforting her, saying that her adoptive parents had committed a great act of love. And Misa tells her that it is also the reason that she has a reason to smile, and that she's very lucky, and Tekna also, agrees. And then Stella is like, well, what are you going to do now, Bloom? Stella, could you look less interested? I don't think that she can. She's over there filing her nails. While I appreciate the original for what it is, the original dialogue, I do think that the 4Kids dub did all of the girls here a much better service with the dialogue that they gave to each character, especially Stella. Instead of asking, you know, well, what are you going to do now, Bloom? Which to me made Stella feel totally disinterested in this like heart-wrenching of a story that Bloom just, you know, divulged to her friends. You know, Stella instead in the 4Kids dub says,
this new info's got you curious about your birth parents, hasn't it?
Which, I mean, to me is so much more thoughtful and kind and nice of Stella. But then Bloom goes on to say, you know, of course I'm curious, wouldn't you be? And she's like, you know, where do I come from? Who are my real parents? You know, where do my powers even come from? But then they all agree to help Bloom on her quest to discover who she really is. And we get this amazing sequence of all the girls calling out to one another, you know, to join in. And I love it so much because, you know, the 4Kids dub, they all one by one, as they're putting their hands into the circle, say, we're the Winx Club. And it's just, I have goosebumps thinking about it. Like, it's so magical and I love it. It's so good. Like, and I love that this is 13 episodes into season 1. We've had all of this character building up until this point, and that this is the mid-season finale. Like, this is the kicker. This is setting the trajectory for the rest of the season of season 1. Bloom discovering and finding out who she actually is. And I love that. I love, you know, the foreshadowing we get in the 4Kids theme song. You know, keep on searching far and wide for the power burning deep inside. Like, that is Bloom's arc. And that is her whole arc through the entire series up until Secret of the Lost Kingdom, the first movie. And I love it. It's magical. It sets us on this path of discovering who Bloom really is, especially in, you know, when it was originally airing in its target audience, what formative years for us, you know, like we were little, we were discovering who we are, you know, as people, as our own persons, you know. It's really transformative and it's really magical. And I love that about this series. So shout out Winx Club, shout out the original series of Winx Club. We love to see it. But that is the episode. That is all of episode 13 of the original season 1 of Winx Club. We are going to take a short break, but when we come back, we're going to discuss obviously the major events, some fun facts of this episode, and determine what the Winx Forever moment of season 1, episode 13 is. So stay tuned. You are listening to the Winx Forever Podcast. Don't miss an episode of the Winx Forever Podcast. Follow the show on your preferred streaming platform so that you're notified when new episodes are released. Winx Forever Podcast presents Magic's High, an original story inspired by the universe of the Winx Club series created by Eugenio Straffi. The City of Magics, capital of the magical dimension and most notably home to 3 of the most prestigious private academies for young fairies, witches, and heroes. But what you probably didn't know is that it is also home to Magic's public high school, the lesser-known school of the magical dimension's capital city. At Magic's High, magical beings from all across the diverse city attend classes for general magic training, history, and tactics. This is where our story begins. Magic's High More Than High School, Chapter 1 is now available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Wattpad. For updates, behind-the-scenes content, and a look further into the magical universe of Magic's High, follow along on our social media. The theme for Magic's High is the song Reflections by Comet off of their debut 2021 album, We're Going to Be Okay. And we are back discussing major events of season 1, episode 13 of the original Winx Club series. And I mean, obviously, one of the biggest events of this episode, Bloom finds out that she is adopted, that she's might not even be from Earth. That is, the biggest major event. Other major events include her obtaining these new powers to see people's inner thoughts and personalities as spirit forms, and that she, has grown as a fairy, that she is, improved since she first arrived at Althea, which is really cool and encouraging to see her growth. Some fun facts. There were no transformations in this episode. We don't get a lot of those. But we have seen quite a few in this season so far. The first time there was no transformations was the first time we were in the Black Mud Swamp with the specialists and the tricks. And then the next episode where we had no transformations was when the girls were grounded and their powers were revoked for going to Cloud Tower. And then the next episode with no transformations was the Miss Magic's episode we discussed last week. So yeah, this is, it's funny that we have, following the episode prior, another episode where no one transforms and we don't see any fairy transformations except for the opening sequence, the theme song. So funny. And then also, fun fact, scenes from this episode, as well as episodes 9, 14, 15, 17, and 18 of the original Winx series were used in the Nickelodeon Winx special Revenge of the Tricks. So this was the part 2 of the, 2-part retelling of season 1. These Nick specials were aired to kind of summarize all episode or all 1, 2, and 3 seasons of the Winx Club so that they could get on to producing new content for the series, which was such a disservice to the reboot of the American, market of Winx Club. So very sad. I have a lot of feelings and opinions about the Nickelodeon era of Winx Club that we will address a different time, we'll save that for later. But at the end of all of our rewatch episodes, we are deciding what is the most Winx-tastic moment, the quintessential Winx moment of this episode that we are calling the Winx Forever moment. And for me, I mean, it's got to be the end, that end scene where all the girls are encouraging Bloom and saying that they will be there for her every step of the way because they are the Winx Club. Like I said, thinking about it just gives me chills. I love it. I love the camaraderie. I love the girl power. I love the support that you feel from these girls and these friends, It's so sweet. It's so Winx. So yeah, that would have to be the Winx Forever moment for me is just Bloom embarking on this journey to discover herself and her friends being there for her every step of the way. It's truly magical. That is all I have for this mid-season finale of Winx Club Season 1, Episode 13. Like I said at the beginning of this episode, I'm going to be taking a little mid-season break myself from uploading episodes for a few weeks, but don't fret. I've got loads of fun content waiting for you over on the Winx Forever Podcast Instagram and other social media, so you won't want to miss out on any of it. So make sure you are following at Winx Forever Podcast everywhere, all the time. Until next time, I am Lola Valentine, and this is the Winx Forever Podcast.
The theme for Winx Forever Podcast is the song She Makes Magic by Big Wild.